Hello comrades and friends, and welcome back to another video on the MCP channel. Now, the biggest driver of conflict in the world is the artificial and inorganic borders which exist propped up by US unipolar hegemony and the corresponding small nationalist projects. I'm going to argue that these should be overcome by larger, regionally integrated civilization states. In the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe, nobody believes in their borders. The preeminent conflict of today, of course, is the Palestinian one, which highlights the unreal borders of the Middle East. It's not just Palestine though. Can anybody give a historical reason for the border between Iraq and Syria? These were not settled by a war, but were drawn up by the British Empire in the same way African borders were created. It was no surprise then that during apartheid, people from all over Africa said that they were South Africans, because they are not invested in the contrived borders which were imposed upon them and that they don't believe in. Let's look at this issue through the context of Palestine in depth, understand what is driving that conflict in particular, and hopefully acquire a lens to understand others in a more nuanced way, like the one in Russia and Ukraine. I choose the Middle East because the Middle East is one of the most obvious examples of borders being rejected in favour of a civilizational pole. Yet whilst it's true that people in Iraq or Syria may not particularly believe in their borders, in Palestine right now these artificial lines are directly causing suffering. Yet the displacement of the Palestinians awakens a regional consciousness in the whole Middle East, where these artificial states are obviously an impediment to reconciling the traditional way of life in the region with the modern age. But where do these borders come from? Why do we have Iraq, Syria, Jordan and Lebanon today? It all happened at the closure of World War I. Firstly, the Hussein-McMahon correspondence in 1916 saw the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, send letters to Hussein bin Ali encouraging an independent Arab state that would be backed by the British if the Arabs would assist the Allies in fighting the Ottoman Empire, which still ruled a massive amount of the Arab world. This is why all of these flags look so similar. They are derived from the Arab revolt colours designed by the British diplomat Mark Sykes to divide the Muslim Ummah, to pit Arab Muslims against Turkish Muslims and destroy the Islamic Caliphate. They wanted to emphasise national over religious identity. The British, for their part, wanted a prominent Muslim on their side against the Ottomans, as the Ottoman Caliph's call for a jihad against the Allies scared them, as it had the potential to unify all Arab and Indian Muslims who would be joining in on the side of Istanbul, which was aligned with the Central Powers. For their support in the war, the Arabs agreed with the British on one condition: if the Arabs fought against the Ottomans, then after the war they would be able to organise their own unified Arab state. The Sharif of Mecca, who I mentioned before, Hussein bin Ali, thinking he would get his independence, kept his end of the agreement, waging the Arab revolt against the Ottomans from 1916. The British backed the Sharif by providing military aid through their liaison Lawrence of Arabia. The British, however, had no intention to follow up on their promise. At the same time as they were making these promises to the Arabs, the British were negotiating with their allies how they would divide up the Ottoman territories amongst themselves. 2 years prior to the end of the war, France and Britain secretly decided in the Sykes-Picot Agreement that they wanted the land for themselves. They split the Ottoman territories into Zones A and Zone B, the origins of what would become Syria and Iraq. France had investments in the Syrian region, and Britain already had Egypt. These plans were obviously contrary to the promise of a unified Arab state. The British wanted to balkanise and control. They had no aims of splitting the Arabs off from the Ottomans just to then let them become a unified power themselves. They had to be split further and further. The details of the Sykes-Picot Agreement were eventually made public by the Bolsheviks in November 1917, making the Arabs begin to distrust the Allies. This coincided with the Balfour Declaration, where the British Foreign Secretary issued the statement of support from the British government for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jews, in a letter from Balfour to Rothschild. Two things then contravening the Hussein-McMahon Agreement. Was Palestine to be part of an independent Arab state, or actually a land for the Zionists? The Balfour Declaration itself actually contradicted even the Sykes-Picot Agreement too, which made no such considerations for a Zionist homeland. After its founding, the new League of Nations established the notion of mandates, where a victor would take over a former German or Ottoman territory just until supposedly the natives were able to protect themselves. So there was the French mandates of Syria and Lebanon, and the British mandates of Palestine, Transjordan and Iraq, which conveniently aligned with a previous agreement. Under the mandate, floods of European Jews kept entering Palestine, and hostilities grew between them and the locals, with Britain promising both groups mutually exclusive things. After the Second World War, the mandates were becoming a burden to Britain and France, who had had their own homelands destroyed. So it was decided that now was the time that the natives were ready to take care of themselves, and so they were granted independence. So these mandates that were made artificially, without the consent of the locals, were now legal, separate nation-states, whose borders had been crystallised and not subject to change. Borders that only exist because they were strategically important to former empires, that the people living in these areas do not even believe in. These borders split up people who wanted to be together, put lines through towns, families, speakers of the same languages. Conversely, they put into one country peoples who didn't want anything to do with each other. This is identical to what happened in Eastern Europe, with artificial lines drawn up from the territory of what was once the multi-ethnic and multilingual Russian Empire, splitting peoples who were always together, and lumping in two groups of people as if they were just one homogeneous nation-state without consent of anyone in them. During Soviet times, with the fraternity and movement that existed then, there was still continuity, and this was not too much of an issue. But after the fall of the USSR, people would all of a sudden find themselves in different countries to their families and their fellow language speakers. Of course, the most prominent and tragic example being Ukraine, with so many Russian speakers in the east, which when a president was elected from that region of the country and was friendly to Russia in his policies, he was deposed by the CIA-backed Maidan coup, disregarding the constitution's requirements for impeachment and beginning the repression of ethnic Russian civilization in terms of religion, culture and language within the Ukrainian borders. Because Kiev disregarded the constitution, the Donbass disregarded the borders declared in that constitution, which they never had a say in the first place, and because of the west of Ukraine's unwillingness to let the east leave, the 8 years of war ensued, leading up to 2022, and the rest is history. But back to the Middle East. In the original agreement, the British were going to allow the Arabs to control their own Ottoman breakaway state. It was to be ruled by Sharif Hussein, but the British declaration to make the land into mandates hurt the relationship with the Sharif. Since he lost backing, he ended up with only a small kingdom on the coast. A conflict arose between two different factions in the Arab world. Hussein bin Ali was a member of the Hashemites, the tribe of Muhammad, but in the 1920s the House of Saud was gaining power, which promoted a fundamentalist Muslim school called Wahhabism or Salafism. In the 20s, Hussein was conquered by the Sauds, who renamed the area the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In the 1950s they found large oil supplies, and they could now fund their extreme ideology with oil money. They could fund scholarship, journalists, universities, professors and militants all over the Islamic world to abide by their version of violent Islam. This, combined with the splitting of the region into mandates like Iraq and Syria, which were never actually meant to govern themselves, led to unrest in the Middle East. The suffering of the Palestinians epitomises the trauma of the whole region, and the whole region sees themselves in it. It is of course ramped up to the extent that they can't even maintain a normal life, being uprooted, their homes taken and being displaced. But looking at their suffering, everyone in the Middle East identifies in it, in the twangs of discomfort they feel back at home. So when Yemenis see what's going on in Palestine, they relate to it and they see in it their own existential predicament. It is the representation of their own problems. They see it as the best summary and most extreme and clearest example of what they face too. In fact, the extremity of it illustrates it in the clearest way. The European slicing of the Middle East has failed because they were imposing the paradigm of a nation-state, which does not articulate the realities of the people there. Ever since then, there have been various awakenings, just as after the century of humiliation in China, when it was split up into the warlord territories and occupied and displaced by Japan, which was their Israel, and that was their Nakba, and it caused their awakening. The formation of the State of Israel caused the first awakening in the Middle East of an Arab nationalism. Then came Iran in 1979 with the Islamic awakening, which was more civilizational, but still nationalistic, and now there must be another. The artificial creation of Israel has highlighted fundamental questions of what is national identity, what is the basis of a state, what is our connection to land, what glues us together as a people. Can we draw lines and import people, and so long as we are backed by enough force, that becomes somehow a real nation? It is an existential question, and in that Israel is the epitome of a criminal excess of Anglo-Saxon modernity, just as South Africa was. That this type of modernity is incompatible with human life, and which therefore, when faced with human life, responds by persecuting it, by punishing it, and by keeping it down. Israel represents the thrusting of modernity into the Islamic world, which views the earth as continuous due to its nomadic origins, and it deals in large civilizational poles rather than strictly defined nations and borders. In this, Israel is an obstruction, as well as all the Balkanized former Ottoman territories, to reconciliation. There now exist borders even between Muslims, and it is in this way that we see the question of Israel is not about Muslims fighting the Jews, but it's the starkest and most obvious highlighting of how the Islamic world needs to respond to modernity internally, since all nation-states and all borders in the Middle East emerging in the last century are unable to be reconciled to the historic Islamic civilization, and Palestine is central to that, as this is elevated from a feeling of unease to actual persecution. Zionists cannot understand that to the people in the Middle East, this is an existential question, not one of physical subsistence and comfort. When it is asked, why not just accept this new line or this new boundary and be guaranteed to survive? It is because we now see that they don't even accept their own boundaries. A two-state or three-state solution will always fail because you're effectively saying, how can you be bribed in order to give up your existence? Existence is not being able to biologically subsist. They'd rather be dead than that. What this conflict is seeking is the right to be what you are at the level of civilization, the same things the Russians are seeking in the Donbass, which is being denied to them. The reason that the Palestinians cannot live inside a line that puts them into Israel is the same reason that Russians cannot live inside the artificial lines putting them into eastern Ukraine that denies them of a civilizational existence. These people in the Middle East will die, they'll quite literally give up their biological subsistence to pursue their right to exist. And back home in the West, how many people really are existing? You can be a quirky consumerist individual in the West and mindlessly follow pop culture. You can go to Starbucks and the next concert and consume and be airy-fairy with the next iPhone 15 and do all these things, but you're not existing, you're subsisting. You have no existence, you have no civilization, religion or culture. It's like you're an animal, like a caged rat just going through the motions of life, thinking that you're autonomous, instead of truly living one in a real cohesive community, an organic civilization or social context. In order to exist, you have to fulfill not just the standard necessary in order to subsist at the biological level. You need to fulfill a meaning and a purpose and a place in the world, and a place is what the Palestinians are seeking. You need to be part of a system beyond yourself and dwell within that. In the West, we turn down the ability to exist, but in Palestine, this is forcefully denied to the people there. So the modern liberal perspective fails in all of its solutions to this conflict, because for those suffering they are not willing to concede in order to materially satisfy their wants and needs, that they would be happy to live in Israel if they could just have wealth and consumer goods. It doesn't work like that. For the Middle East, their resonating support for the Palestinians is not about doing them a favour because they are so morally good, but it's about saying, they are us, there is no difference between us. Being safe biologically cannot satisfy their existence when, say, the safety of the Al-Aqsa Mosque cannot be guaranteed, as Nasrallah said. I mean, that sounds metaphysical, but what it means is there's a striving and a passion for regional integration through united Middle East of Islamic civilization, which historically existed as civilization states, culminating in what? The Ottomans and the Safavids. Dignity. Dignity means something concrete, a civilizational regional state. This conflict is about the fight for a larger, new polarity. There is a pole driving the passions of the whole people in the whole region, and they want to see that established. And it's enough to raise questions about their borders and their leaders, especially when they see their professed Muslim leaders complete inaction on the Palestinian issue. The West is shocked at the Muslim world's willingness to die. We see them speak of how much the Israelis love life and the Palestinians love death. But the Israelis are just Western liberals. They have nothing to die for except near-naked dancing on TikTok and being a bastion of promiscuous nightclubs. They have no existence like the increasing amounts of the population in the West who aren't really living at all. At least the Muslim world is willing to die in order to live. They won't just take a deal so they can live biologically, because biologically subsisting is not enough. They would rather die than submit to this unipolar empire of pornography and nihilism, and will never submit, for they seek their own great pole, which can have an ability to have its values fulfilled. That is their dignity, and they will always resist anyone attempting to impose an external regime upon them. The Chinese would have rather chosen death than the regime imposed upon them by colonial powers of their weak, fragmented state in the warlord era, and this is no different. Existence is the fulfillment of the aspiration of your forefathers and the cognizance of how they would look down upon you, knowing that you submitted to foreign regimes out of bribery and convenience. Israel doesn't have an existence, it can't exist. It's not a civilization. You can't take people from around the world, just putting them into one place and expecting them to fulfill what is becoming of a nation. If anything, that's like ISIS trying to draw people from all random four corners of the earth with no organic basis in the land, uprooting the people indigenous to Syria and Iraq to try and create a synthetic nation there. Look at Israeli citizens, they're nihilistic, they don't believe, they're cynical, they don't believe in their own national project, they have nothing to live for and nothing to die for. Israel is pure force, and pure power literally is the only reason there are even people in the IDF in Israel, because they have forcible conscription. Force is what sustains the state of Israel, it's what is the basis of a state of Israel. Not that there are people living in a certain way and organically establish a corresponding state to that, no. But China, for example, is not made by force. If the communists were not in charge, it would still be China. China and Russia have collapsed politically so many times, and always civilizationally was still China and Russia. But if a Zionist political entity collapsed, there would never be an Israel again, since it has no roots in its own people, it has no roots in the land, it has no roots in any civilizational pole, in any people, in any sort of organic community. If a Zionist entity was overthrown, there would be no way it could ever refound itself. How many times have the Iranian Empire and the Ottomans collapsed, and they kept coming back? This would not be the case for Israel, which is a fake country. It's a fake state. If it collapsed, nothing would take its place. This part of the world has always been part of a greater whole, and on that, Israel is an abstraction. What then were these greater wholes? Something called civilization states, the successors to the Mongols. A different type of empire which had a universalism that was set against all local and particular realities, which is why their successor states would form the largest land-based empires in history, which would include a great many religious, linguistic, etc. traditions within them. The Mongols, the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, the USSR, and the People's Republic of China cannot be compared with the European colonial powers, for they are one continual civilization state, and not imperialist. Imperialism is not civilizational. Most imperialist colonial empires did not have geographical continuity like civilizational empires, but have a core and then various detached periphery colonies. Even the ones that did have continuity in terms of land established the same dynamic of abstract domination and control of one region over all of the others through the creation of artificial barriers. Whereas civilizational states had no barriers and existed as universal empires, as effectively one giant country with a multiplicity of ethnicities, languages and religions, united rather than divided, with one dominating all the others. As an example, you know that the Ottoman Empire was not about the domination of Islam over Christianity. They recruited Byzantines into their ranks, and we know that the early Ottomans employed a large number of Christians as soldiers and administrators. At the same time, why did the Ottomans put little to no pressure on Christians in their realm to convert to Islam? Not only that, but why did they exhibit moderation and even a keen interest in reconciliation when it came to dealing with Christians? Why did they fight their fellow Muslims who were part of a small beyliks on a number of occasions in order to incorporate them into the larger empire? Why did the Ottomans allow a great deal of freedom for heterodoxy within Islam? The Ottomans were well known for not only allowing, but in some cases sponsoring, esoteric and folk-style religious sects, which went hand in hand with every time they expanded, like when they expanded their frontiers in the 14th century. For colonial empires, we don't see this at all. Even when there was geographical continuity, civilizational continuity was prevented. Germany's aspirations in the Balkans, for example, had nothing to do with wanting to integrate with the Slavic people and fuse with them, like we could say that the motive of China would have been for Xinjiang. The Germans wanted to enslave them, rob their resources, colonize their lands, and treat the Slavic peoples as the other imperial powers treated the non-European peoples. To Germany, they were nothing more than a white Africa. There was geographical continuity, but no civilizational continuity at all. But in Asiatic empires, there existed only one state, only one country without barriers between them. There is no distinction between the core and the peripheries. There's no colonies. As the empire expands, both the conquerors and the conquered change in a dialectic with one another. Chinese identity changed every time China expanded. But for Britain, taking Nigeria or Senegal wouldn't change the British homeland either way. Nobody would even notice. When the Ottoman Empire expanded, for example, we see a new synthesis and merging of cultures, such as the entire empire taking on the Arabic script. Large civilization states are the next organic stage of human development as multipolarity fully ramps up and the unipolar order dies. Small nations do not have the right to exist free of the emergent social dynamics within their poles, and their borders are only crystallized by the power and might of a so-called rules-based international order, and they do not exist organically or can be defended by their own might. These dynamics will lead to many smaller pieces in a pole coalescing into civilization states. As the US leadership of the world dies, the borders of their allied small countries can't be propped up, and the powerful unified poles emerge where they are, where neighbours will cooperate instead of fight each other over small nationalism, which is convenient because it neutralises them right now, so that the single pole isn't challenged because all the small countries are fighting each other instead of forming one giant country. But it is too late for the US. The Eurasian pole is already emerging, and Russia and China are being driven into each other's arms more and more by Western actions. With a ramping up of the Palestinian conflict, an Islamic pole is rising above the pathetic nationalist infighting of the fake countries and borders of the Middle East, especially as people see that they have more in common with Muslims abroad and that their professed Muslim governments are inactive on this issue in supporting their brethren. It's on these grounds that Dugin supports something like a great Eurasian imperium. It's not about conquering to enslave people like the colonialists. He views much of the Soviet territories as sharing a similar, fundamental social reality like the former Ottoman ones do. Because of this shared social substance and shared sphere of activity, it's proper that they share a political reality as well, in Eastern Europe and the Middle East alike. but it is in the Americans' interest to prevent these poles from rising and to emphasise different ethnic, national, linguistic identities of the various separate nations to be pitted against one another rather than merging into a civilisationally based union. They want blood to be thicker than culture or religion in order to keep neighbours at war. The only way a small, artificial nation can even carve out an existence separate from the pole in which it resides and have their own little territory and their borderlines secured to pretend to be an organic development is if the US international rules-based order uses its looming threat to secure that roleplay for them. That's why Israel exists. An organic dynamic would involve great powers within individual poles forging great empires. Giant land-based empires should be the norm. Imperialism isn't just when you have a big empire. Multipolarity is the future, and Dugin supports this and provides some theoretical framework to help establish its legitimacy. This is why as communists we defend him. Chairman Mao said in On Contradiction, "The nomadic system of Mongolia and Central Asia has been directly linked with socialism. Socialism arises from modernity and the way in which it completely uprooted and destroyed the sociality that had been taken for granted prior. The abstraction of a common economic or social reality, some kind of common social bond that unites us, was not explicit because it was taken for granted before modernity, so words communism and socialism were not needed. These words specifically arise when the abstraction of sociality becomes intelligible, which is only when it is somehow uprooted, challenged, or universally alienated from individuals. The Mongol Empire laid the hidden foundations of modernity. All the successor states to the Mongols in some degree are socialist or communist. The trauma of a Mongol invasion created the necessary abstraction from those immediate social bonds, allowing for some kind of sociality in the abstract to then become intelligible. The Mongols brought a kind of universalism set against all local and particular realities, and whose successors would form the large, land-based empires. Mongol universalism is an alternative lost form of modernity. The successor states of the Mongol Empire, such as the Ottoman Empire, Tsardom of Muscovy, Yuan and Qing dynasties, unlike the mercantile states, fall under what Marx called the Asiatic mode of production. There are no real property rights, it all belongs to the sovereign, and there is an economy orientated towards big communal infrastructure projects, to an extent planned for a common social purpose. These states differed from the mercantile ones in that they were based not in the abstraction of selling obtained goods from somewhere else on for profit as the goal, but in the production of concrete things or use values. It was based on the production and accumulation of things, not of numbers. The difference between this and feudalism is that feudalism, as well as being particular to Europe, is where the sovereign recognises property rights. Early modern Russia, for example, wasn't feudal, but it became so after Peter the Great's, supposedly the Great's, westernising reforms, importing serfdom, etc., which weren't fully undone until the end of the Stalin era. All of these empires' legacies have persisted, and the states that have succeeded the land-based empires embody communism to a degree, although at the moment this is only explicit within China. The Mongol invasion abstracted all of the local civilizations, peoples and forms of production from their immediate local sociality and subjected them to a form of abstract universalism in the form of the Mongol state. What the Mongols introduced was a conception of a truly universal state, one that's impartial to religious and ethnic differences, even if in some of them there was a guiding established religion, like in the case of the Ottomans and Russia, and in China statehood itself was a form of religion really. Look how many races and religions live under Russia, China or the Ottomans. Not only is the Mongol universalism comparable to European modernity, it is its lost material basis. European modernity is just a subjective articulation of the objective historical change ushered in by the Mongols. Socialism has an objectivity. It is not based in the subjective and voluntary implementation of just a more moral system. It's not just reducible to a political or ideological project. It's almost as simple as the difference between MCM and CMC, the reduction of everything to a series of use values, with the forces of production anchored by some common social substance, usually expounded in the form of a religiously conceived state. The sublime state, as the Ottomans called it. This is actually the driving force of production instead of the accumulation of commodities, but the reproduction of a common social and religious substance that ultimately defines this mode of production. That the default citizens or the average constituents of that society's way of life can be reproduced, that is the ultimate end and aim of the economy itself. So it's more than just the feudal CMC production of things and commodities, but it's the reproduction of ways of life that glue together civilization. This glue is expounded in the form of a sublime state, such as the role of the emperor in the undivided church in the Roman Empire of Byzantium, in being able to call the ecumenical councils and such, and similarly for the role of a caliph of the Ummah. So what's unique about the Mongols and their specific contribution to civilization is taking individuals and communities from their immediate sociality and subjecting them to being a part of a higher form of community. Of course, a lot of people are scandalised by a load of monarchies being on this supposed list of socialist countries, but in the truest sense, socialism is inherently monarchical, in the correct sense of the word. Just because these states were autocratic and monarchical, it doesn't prevent them being socially orientated. You can't superimpose the prejudices of modern liberalism onto the past, it's completely meaningless. You can't call them autocratic regimes as if the burden is upon them to constitute themselves as states and that the default state of humanity is liberal democracy, civil society. There's no default state of humanity that liberalism can lay claim to. Actually, liberalism is the most violent form of abstractionism from the default norm of humanity for thousands and thousands of years. Also, almost every great socialist or even anti-imperialist leader was a monarch in some sense. In modern communism, this isn't hereditary necessarily, but Stalin and Mao and today Xi, Kim Jong-un, Putin, Assad, these are princes, they're kings in the real sense of the word, and there's nothing wrong with that. Every real society is unified by a monarch. The US president was supposed to have more power than the British monarch, by the will of the American founding fathers at least, and the term limits are only recently arising things because it's only recently that you need changing terms, since the deep state rules behind the scenes regardless of who's the president nowadays. Before term limits, if someone's rule didn't just keep going on and on, it was just because they weren't a good king and you had to find the next king. Every true king does have the backing of the people. The purpose of the cycle of democracy is not to elect a president, but is to ask, is this still the true king? Every real king bases his power on popular sovereignty. Every great revolution in history was against fake monarchs. Every real monarch is with his people against the aristocracy, and the people can use the power of a monarch to appeal against that aristocracy. That's why Julius Caesar stood for the poor, because he went beyond what the institutions of the Republic could do, because they led to corruption, where only the elite were represented. It's the exact same as the power of the image of Mao in challenging the party bureaucracy during the Cultural Revolution. When you say monarchy, people just think about the European monarchs of a modern period of history, which were of course extremely decadent, corrupt, fake rulers, but a true monarchy is a good thing. Neoliberal democracies are far more dictatorial, tyrannical and despotic than the monarchies of the real dynasties. You wouldn't have been able to do Australia's lockdown in the Ottoman Empire, as has said. The Mongols were a force of levelling for all the settled civilizations they came to encompass, but that levelling gave rise to the greatest world historical empires seen on Earth, and the poles that are now rising in opposition to the US unipole as we enter the age of multipolarity are the Mongol successors. When the Mongols created civilization, they cleared the way for a form of indifferent, universal states that gave rise to the greatest empires of history. All civilization has been defined by the dialectic between nomadism and sedentary settled civilization. Nomads are an invigorating force which lets the civilization return to its original founding realities. The Mongols were the expression of the nomadism of universal humanity, creating the first universal world historical empires. In Europe, this was only ever given subjective, but not political expression, trying to mentally rationalise and articulate a universal world, but that was the creation of the Mongols. This mental reflection in Europe is what we call modernity. We think of modernity as beginning in Europe with the Renaissance, but it actually begins with the Mongols. It was given subjective expression only by the Europeans, trying to flee away from the implications of Mongols, a cope, if you will, against the legacy of Mongol conquest. After the Mongol Empire dissolved, its successor states were the preeminent world historical empires. That's what communism is. Communism is the lost enlightenment of Asia, the return to the Timurid Renaissance, which was on a different trajectory to the European one. Europe runs away from the Mongols, but now we in the West must return to the bosom of Asia. Like Has said, if you keep fleeing west forever, you'll end up east. Our patriotism is about returning Europe to Asia. Europe ran away from Asia, and now we must return civilizationally. We are Eurasianists. We all belong as part of bigger poles. Not only should we not be asking whether Scotland or Ireland should become separate political entities than England, but we should be asking why are we not in a geographically continuous state with the Nordic countries or the rest of North Europe. That's what bringing the East-West would look like. These artificial lines and small countries and squabbling with neighbours, they just need to be put to rest as we integrate into the larger regional poles. It can't be resisted for much longer. But why is Zionism so significant in causing this multipolar awakening? Why does seeing this artificial state lead people to see the artificial nature of their communities and political system at home? Well, Zionism reveals the truth of the uniparty system. On the domestic level, seeing the enslavement of both political parties to Zionism is causing an awakening in the West too, revealing the political distinctions as they've been established here to be completely fake. It is a watershed moment that is seeing the rise of forces that are outside the two-party system, such as the Workers' Party of Britain. Meanwhile, all political subcultures and communities gear up to defend Israel from totally different and contradictory perspectives. Conservatives who are critical of Israel are attacked by the con-grifters, so-called dissident right, media as being anti-white, anti-European, unpatriotic, siding with the country's enemies, aligned with LGBT, Palestine protesters and BLM activists. Yet when there are authentic socialist voices criticising Israel, like Jackson and Has, they are accused of fascism, chauvinism, as being ultra-right and anti-Semitic Nazis. The matrix is imploding because all of the synthetic political subcultures, which people fall for, and they fall into them for genuine reasons, but they are mobilising their members towards the same aim by different reasonings, by accusing members of each side of having the opposite position to what they have. If you're anti-Zionist and you're a leftist, the Zionists are trying to paint you as a right-winger. If you're a conservative who's anti-Zionist, the Zionists are trying to portray you as a leftist. So we see that the Zionist gatekeeping hegemony's control of both sides of the political aisle and media in the culture war, which is why we must not be over-focused on it, lest we leave ourselves victim to be compartmentalised in this way into one side or another, and be weaponised and funneled into supporting the same thing. All the fighting over both wokeness and anti-wokeness are created artificially, but we must remember that they are adopted by people for authentic reasons. But we must not define ourselves by that alone. For however much we, or the people of Palestine even, would not ever live the lifestyle of a blue-haired LGBT protester, Zionism flushes out the shills and reveals the truth in even what that person is saying. Because we can tell that anyone who is being attacked by Zionists, well, we can't help but seeing that they have something authentic about their position, no matter the personal and or cultural disagreements we have with them. So we can be understanding that, yeah, this person or that person might be caught up in an unhealthy community, be it the red pill community or a devious subculture, but they are probably doing it and saying what they're saying for an authentic reason. Likely they're authentically struggling with their family life, a little confused, but they're still human and they're still trying to authentically understand their place in the world somehow, just through the language and the media that they've been fed to them. The same thing is the case with the conservatives. Their conspiracies, blaming everything on the communists, they arrive at all of these explanations for authentic reasons, and they'll grasp at any theory. They're clutching at straws. They are genuinely sceptical, but it's not their fault that what they're fed to explain what they see in front of them is just nonsense. Now, this is the case for the individuals who fall victim to the subcultures, not the influencers promoting them. They're the paid shills. They do know what they are doing, they do have an agenda, they know that both sides are serving the same master, and they are ideologists. But when it comes to ordinary people who identify with this or that current in society, we have to understand that they are just victims of the inauthentic political distinctions which have been thrust upon them and they've taken a side on, probably for some real reason in their life experience. But we should be able to see through this now, because Zionism is inauthentic community at its highest. The only community based synthetically on finance capital being built from scratch by it. The need for this artificial community came from the inability of European nation states to be universal. So this different group, the Jews, was thought to be an exceptional problem that needed to be solved by excluding them from the national projects of Europe. This speaks to the failure of the nation-state project itself. If Jews are unable to be part of a European nation-state project, this exposes the pathetic form of a small, ethno-nationalist nation-state. As we enter into the era of civilizational states, it becomes a lot more obvious that Jews can be at home in the European lands, and they don't need to be their own ethnic nation-state, since a civilization state doesn't mean everyone needs to share that exact same culture or exact same religion. Civilization is how people relate to one another in a determinate way. If a Jew in Russia makes a contribution in medicine, that is an achievement for all of Russia, even if he is not an Orthodox Christian. Civilization is a determinate relation of people, and although there are different groups who have different ways of life, they're all part of one whole, one civilization. This civilizational concept of social formation prioritizes geopolitics and works from the concrete to the abstract, starting with the organization of territorial relations, with the modes of production and accumulation, proceeding up through norms, social mores, customs, ethnic identity, and then finally up into the legal forms and of the state as such. On the other hand, the modern nation-state is the other way around completely. As a form, it's a concept that proceeds from the abstract to the concrete. The ideal of a rational national organisation is to be imposed from the top down. Civilizations are authentic, while the nation-state is synthetic. Sublation of the dialectic of civilization and state is communism. What we are witnessing today with the rise of multipolarity and the rise of a multipolar world order is the impending destruction of Zionism and, with it, all synthetic communities, which are hangovers from capitalist modernity. All the political subcultures, etc., are epitomised by Zionism. Whilst in Europe the old inauthentic capitalist form of a nation-state is still ruling over what are authentic civilizations with people from those real geographies that they've always inhabited. The pressure on this false form of community and nation-state is fiercer on the highly inauthentic state of Israel, because its inauthentic form is revealed by its clear, inorganic civilization and geography that comes with uprooting the premises of civilization and trying to build one from scratch, consciously as an intentional project to resolve the problem of nation-states in Europe, by creating a nation from scratch with no material premises other than the rational, abstract formalism of a European nation-state. The destruction of Israel at this moment is because of a rise of a multipolar world, which is the rise of polarities and civilizations. Zionism reveals the falsehood of Western politics at large, from the bipartisan function of our political systems to the very notion of a nation-state in itself. It reveals the origin of the political positions that are so hotly debated in Parliament, online, on TV, of both of the established leftists and conservatives as being the synthetic creations of private interests. Zionism flushes all of this out, as we see the ludicrous nature of a synthetic creation of private interests, of class interests, elevated to the status of an entire nation. This doesn't mean that Jews are that class, but that the creation of a nation from scratch in this way is the pure capitalist form of community, and it's the same inauthenticity we see in our communities back home, whether it's the conflict between the LGBT and the traditionalist roleplay communities, etc., the red pill, whatever, etc. It's all just synthetic, like Zionism. Zionism represents the inauthenticity of community itself. Yes, in the fact that our political establishment is false, but also on a personal level. The reason that people are dyeing their hair pink and doing these Antifa protests, smashing up stuff nonsense, or why the young men are buying into this trad, make me a sandwich LARP, is due to authentic strife within their communities, but then they adopt these subcultures as a way of dealing with that very real and authentic problem, which is fed to them from inauthentic places. But it has become clear that these positions do not stem from any authentic civilization, but the artificial interests of the institutional hegemony. Zionism is awakening not because the Jews are the centre of the world, but that it reveals how inauthentic the politics, media, social groupings, and national borders are in our own world. There are authentic reasons why people relate to whichever community that's been manufactured, whichever one appeals to them most. But where they come from is rooted in something inauthentic, and we shouldn't allow it just to be fed to us and suck it up. Zionism cuts across the established distinctions, revealing the inauthenticity of established politics and societal divides. This is why, my friends, we should forgive people for their naivety for buying into this or that inauthentic community, but we should not forgive the influencers. But those of us who have been duped on both sides must now realise how we've been used. I hope this video has helped illustrate the awakening effect of inauthenticity highlighted by Israel, the inauthenticity of our communities, the inauthenticity of our political system, and the inauthenticity of the world's borders. And I hope this makes you think about a new civilizational, regionally integrated, multipolar world that is coming with the end of the US unipolar empire. Thank you very much for all of your attention, and see you in the next one.
Yeah.